Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Freedom. As usual, I'm your host, Aya Fubara Eneli. Excited for us to have this conversation. And today we're going to be talking about America in free fall, the attack on the Voting Rights Act, and some might say the battle for democracy. Today we're going to be revisiting one of the most pivotal pieces of legislation in American history, and that's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And confronting a very hard truth that the very law that helped secure democracy for millions is now under very real and deliberate attack. Let's take a moment to understand and remember why this act was necessary to begin with before I bring in my guest, who I know you are going to be excited to hear. In 1965, nearly a century after the 15th Amendment promised that no citizen would be denied the right to vote because of race, that promise remained largely broken. In parts of the Deep South, where I reside, less than 7% of eligible Black voters were registered. In Alabama, only about 19% of Black adults were on the rolls. In Mississippi, we were looking at about 6.7%. And of course, the great state of Texas didn't really keep that kind of information because why would they? White citizens' councils, literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright violence made it virtually impossible for many Black Americans to exercise their most basic right. That also included other people who were not white. The Voting Rights Act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965, and it sought to change all of that. It outlawed discriminatory practices and required certain states and counties with a history of voter suppression to seek federal preclearance, remember that, before altering any election laws. The results were immediate and profound. Within just a few years, Black voter registration in the South had, in some cases, more than tripled. By 1968, Mississippi had gone from 6.7% to nearly 60% Black voter registration. And across the South, the number of Black elected officials grew from fewer than 100. Remember this for all of you who say voting doesn't matter. Grew from fewer than 100 in 1965 to over 7,000 by the early 2000s. So the Voting Rights Act bill doesn't just protect ballots, it transforms representation and aims to give voice to the voiceless. But now we are facing an ongoing erosion, and I'm not going to get into the details because our guest today will do that for us. To help us unpack today in our conversation, I'm joined by a returning guest, almost exactly a year to the last time that he was here with us. Scholar, historian, even though he might say he isn't. Ajali, and if you don't know what that means, you're not supposed to. Freedom fighter, community activist. He's the host of a series of shows. You may have seen him as a contributor on Roland Martin Unfiltered, usually on Thursday nights. He also hosts Auburn View mornings on Wednesdays through Friday mornings, I believe, and that's channel 126 on Sirius XM. And of course, In Class with Carr every Saturday for, I think, what are we, 293 Saturdays in a
Yes,
row?
man. Yeah.
Something like that,
Coming on
which you
300.
can find on YouTube at no cost to you.
That's
But
right.
if you really wanted to jump in deeper with the community, you can join narrative.com, and that is narrative with a K. And so today we have with us none other than Dr. Greg Carr. Welcome back to Rethinking Freedom, sir.
Oh, it's an honor to be here with you, my sister, my comrade, and my long time friend. It's always good to be with you, Counselor. And congratulations on passing the first year of Rethinking Freedom for everyone
Thank you.
listening. Absolutely. For everybody listening or watching. I remember when you were contemplating adding it to your already insane schedule, and I'm glad you did, and I know we all are as well. And I'm also glad that you added over the arc of the last year your work with women in resistance, Those of you who haven't seen Women in Resistance, you got to go to the Adesoji Speaks Knowledge YouTube channel, Adesoji Speaks Knowledge, and you will see our sister allowing herself to be the instrument through which women over the arc of millennia, women of African descent, present their wisdom and their wisdom teachings, their Sebait to us. So, and then you decided, well, while I'm at it, let me go ahead and cover the whole African world. So you don't want to miss the African News Review every week. So I don't know where you found the time to do all this, but I know that it began in many ways with rethinking freedom. And so I'm glad to be here in conversation with you as always, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. And of course, I find the time the same place you find the time when you do 20 million things all at the same time, but the same place where those who came
Mm,
before us found the time to do the work that is necessary, that was necessary for us to attain the rights that we are enjoying today, and largely many of us ignoring. And we
yeah,
have
bro.
work to do for the next generation. So thank you for
Yeah,
all that
bro.
you do in our community.
Yeah, bro. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You're welcome and thank you. Yes. So we talking voting rights, huh?
Yes. So tell us, what is the state of the Voting Rights Act? I hear there was some kind of hearing on October 15th with the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown was not taking any prisoners, but we will start wherever you please.
Well, I mean, no, she wasn't. The Louisiana versus Calais case, where the white nationalists of Louisiana have decided to once again try to destroy the Voting Rights Act, which is not a permanent piece of legislation, as we know, which has to be renewed, and it's been renewed several times, as we know as well. We'll talk about that too in a moment. But you know, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, of course, is permanent, or at least as long as there's the United States of America. And in many ways, this battle over who gets to vote, this battle over how easy it is or difficult it is to get to the polls and exercise the franchise, this battle in many ways may determine how long this American experiment, or as I often refer to it, criminal enterprise, continues. The Voting Rights Act, of course, as you kind of laid out, as you not kind of, as you did lay out, is the pathway to open up the ability to shape the government through the ballot box. And it not only protects, or at least attempts to protect people of African descent from exercising the franchise, it attempts to stop discrimination against anyone. The language is very plain as it was passed. Uh, and I'll just read it to be explicit, an act to enforce the 15th from 1965, August 1965, signed into law after a great and bloody struggle. An act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Probably we should go before we go any further. The 15th Amendment to the United States is very short. It's very simple. The 15th Amendment, Section 1, which was proposed February 26, 1869, and ratified February 3rd, 1870. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It's very plain. And then Section 2, of course, even shorter, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And it is Section 2 which authorizes the Supreme Court, authorizes the Congress to enforce the 15th Amendment. It's important because as soon as it was passed, the next year, 1966, it was tried 1 year after the passage by Thurgood Marshall, who litigated on behalf of his uh, his parties, but also really on behalf of the people, an attack on the Voting Rights Act, the first one, which what resulted in the South Carolina, no surprise there, South Carolina versus Katzenbach case. And that's where the Supreme Court upheld the Voting Rights Act as a valid exercise of, of Congress's power to enforce the 15th Amendment. We just heard Section 2. It reinforced the validity of the Voting Rights Act. So, you know, as soon as it was passed, the white nationalists decided that, hey, let's see if we can get it gutted or thrown out. And what is the it we're talking about? The Voting Rights Act, an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and for other purposes. be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States in America, of America rather, in Congress, assembled, that this act shall be known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what we saw attacked again, this time
Again.
from this time from the Confederate state of Louisiana, is Section 2. That was Section 1. Here's Section 2, very short. No voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedure shall be imposed or applied by any state or political subdivision to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. Seems pretty straightforward, but as you know better than I do, and better than most people, because as a practicing attorney and as a student of legal history and of the law broadly, not just here, obviously in the United States, but around the world, you know that plain language in the law means absolutely nothing if the judge says it doesn't mean what it plainly
Absolutely.
says. so so that's what we're facing in Louisiana as they attempt to destroy the power of the vote for people who they disagree with philosophically. And by they, I'm talking about a very narrow group of white nationalists in this country. One other thing I'll say, I won't mention Section 3, but I will mention Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting
Right.
Rights Act, because a few years ago in 2013, another of the Confederate states, Shelby County, Alabama, went after Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by going after Section 4. Because what
Mhm.
happened was there are historically uh, polities or sections of the country or places within states or sometimes whole states in the United States of America who have demonstrated such an egregious flaunting of voting rights, particularly as they discriminate against Black folk, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 said in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, you need to be pre-cleared before you change any voting laws in your polity, in your state, in your locality. You've got to send that change to the uh, to the Department of Justice, to the federal government. We need to see what your state or political subdivision did, because just to make sure that you weren't discriminating. And that's because you have a history of discrimination.
Mhm.
Alabama, Mississippi, these places like that. And in order to do that, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act established a process, or at least established that there should be a process for determining whether or not these covered areas, they call them covered areas, the areas covered in Section 5, have been discriminating. And we can think of that as a formula. There needs to be a formula created to determine whether or not your proposed changes will discriminate against discrete and instant minorities, Black people, brown people. And so what we saw in the South Carolina case finally is an attempt to go after Section 2, because in the Shelby County versus Holder case, a conservative, so-called conservative majority of the Supreme Court uh, ruled in a 5-4 decision, striking down Section 4, to kind of paraphrase Justice John Roberts, who's a nasty piece of work. He's done some nasty work over the arc of his uh, generation on the court. He said that, well, these formulas are old, they're outdated. Discrimination is past. People are voting. And of course, the minority, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other in that 5-4 decision, others, they said, yeah, the reason that there is less discrimination is because of
Oh,
Section 5 and
yes.
Section 4. So they were able to get rid of when people talk about gutting the Voting Rights Act, they were able to get rid of Section 5 in a way by getting rid of Section 4, the formula by which the polities would have to be pre-cleared, and that left Section 2. And that's what the direct attack has been on in October of this year. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If they succeed, of course, they hope to basically wipe out millions of people, not from voting. They're working on that with strict voter ID and things like that. What they're really working on is wiping out those people's ability to select representatives of their choice by
Yes.
diluting
So,
their
so I
vote.
was, so I was going to ask you, could you break down what this current case is about? What is it that Louisiana is trying to do?
Well, the bottom line is that depending on the Supreme Court decision, if in Louisiana Calais, if it goes the way that these folks in Louisiana want it to go, it could be one of the most consequential decisions for voting rights in our lifetime. It'll be a turning point, a major turning point in the country. What they're trying to do is there are two what they call opportunity districts in the state of Louisiana. These are districts where non-white folk have an opportunity to elect, in this case, the United States Congress, representatives of their choice who will represent their interests. And it gets a little tricky after that, and we won't have to get into the weeds on it. But the bottom line is this: Louisiana is about a third black.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there are two congressional districts out of the, I think it's seven. I think it's seven congressional districts in Louisiana, if memory serves me correctly, where there are black representatives. Troy Carter and Cleo Fields happen to be the two representatives in Louisiana. That is because their congressional districts are drawn in such a way where black folk don't make up the majority in the district, but they make up a plurality that's close enough to a majority so that if they vote generally in a certain way, other people and then other people in the districts will vote. And when you combine black folks' vote with everybody else's vote, they really have an opportunity to elect someone who will represent their interests. But that's where it gets a little messy. What Louisiana is trying to do is redraw the districts in a way that break up
Mm-hmm.
those black folk. Or in other words, kind of
Like what we've done in Texas.
tech absolutely what's done happened again in Texas. And of course, it'd be interesting we talk about that, the implications of this, because a great deal of this, while all of this is essential, it really does accrue to us, everyone listening, everyone who has listened to you over the arc of this year and beyond, as you've gotten really deep into local policy and connected it to national policy, it really comes down to us. There are two terms that we probably need to mention: cracking and packing. And
Yeah.
that is a way that you can so-called gerrymander, if you can get away with it, to pack as many black people in one congressional district as possible, and then for those who you can't pack into one district, so we can't stop y'all from having one congressperson, so we'll just pack everybody there. Well, then you crack the black sections of the state or the polity, and you spread those black people out into other districts where they don't have any chance of electing someone who represents their interests. But this case was
So,
just living. Oh, go ahead.
let me interject really quickly there. So, for those of you here in Central Texas, which is where I reside, you know that they carved out a donut. We were one round area, and that was an area where increasingly it was looking purple and definitely leaning blue. And then the only reason it wasn't blue was because we weren't coming out to vote.
Exactly.
And so, as they noticed that, um, the last redistricting, not this racial gerrymandering one that they just did, but the one before that, they basically took that whole area and they carved out a hole in the middle of it where you had a concentration of black and brown people, and they took and created a donut. So some of us are in the outer donut, and then some of us were just taken from the inside and added into a district that is overwhelmingly white. So it doesn't even matter if we come out, if 80% of us of eligible voters who are black and brown in that district, if we come out and vote, we're still not going to have any impact on who is elected if the white residents decide that that they know who they want, and that's not who we want. So yes, so in our community, you guys already understand this notion of cracking and packing because we are living it right now.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we'll come back to that again over the arc of our few minutes together, surely, because Louisiana is in court, and this was brought up over and over again by Janae Nelson, who argued the case for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund at the Supreme Court. This is 2024, of course, where we're having this conversation. And of course, folks listening to this 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 2 years from now, if there's still a country, will look back and see whether or not we got this right in our conversation in terms of predicting what could happen. But we know that last year, 2023, another of the Confederate states, again, Alabama, which seems to always be involved, as is Texas and Louisiana and South Carolina in this nasty business. The Supreme Court decided a case that came out of Alabama involving the so-called black belt of Alabama called Allen versus Milligan. And
Mm-hmm.
Allen, and so the same arguments in many ways that were presented in Allen versus Milligan are being presented again in Louisiana versus Calais. It really is a legal civil war. The white nationalists of the South, the old Confederacy, the Confederacy, it's not an old Confederacy, it remains a Confederacy, continue to try to destroy the opportunity for non-white nationalists to exercise their franchise, their ability to vote in a way where they can be represented. And I think it's important to make a distinction. This isn't all white people. In fact, I would argue it's not a majority of white people. It's a hardcore group of white nationalists, many of them funded with shadow money, some shadowy money, where these plaintiffs getting this money to sue, and in heavily gerrymandered, uh, redistricted state legislatures. And while a governor's election, like a Senate election, is statewide, and I agree with Gary Chambers, our brother Gary Chambers in Louisiana, who says the South isn't red, the South is underorganized
Mm-hmm.
because governors' uh, mansions can be flipped. Senate seats can be flipped if enough of us get out to vote. And I know
That's
that,
absolutely right.
and you've been doing that work for a great deal of time, and you get, but then you see the next step, because when you gerrymander the state legislatures, you may end up with a situation like North Carolina. North Carolina has consistently not elected Republicans statewide for governorship, for attorney general, but then what they do is they gerrymander the the legislature in North Carolina so heavily that even with a Democratic governor, the heavily gerrymandered North Carolina legislature has such a majority of Republicans. South Carolina is very similar, although they don't have an yet elected Democratic governor, that they pass laws that the governor vetoes, and then they override the veto because they got such a majority, what they call a super majority in the legislature. Well, Texas is a lot closer, I think, in many ways than North Carolina to breaking that if people will get out to vote. But in Allen versus Milligan, the issue was absolutely cracking and packing. What happened was it was a historic win, though, for voting rights. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of black voters in Alabama because it was so egregious, the gerrymandered districts, and there was so much evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the court affirmed that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act you can consider race,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what the plain language says, in the redistricting process to provide equal opportunities. They said you have packed and cracked too much. So
Yeah.
a second congressional district, of course, was established in Alabama. Terry Sewell was in the one district in Alabama around Selma, the so-called Black Belt. A second district was established, and that's where Shamari Figures currently serves in the Congress. And of course, both Allen versus Milligan and Louisiana versus Calais rely on a legal test that was again argued at the Supreme Court. That test was established in a case called Thornburg versus Gingles. This is from 1986. And that case, the Thornburg case, the Supreme Court found that the system of at-large elections of state legislators in North Carolina illegally diluted black voting strength in violation of the Voting Rights Act. And in its decision, the court affirmed that this vote dilution violates the Voting Rights Act, regardless of whether there is proof of discriminatory intent. We'll come to intent again in a moment, because 4 years before Thornburg versus Gingles, which was 1982, the United States Congress amended the Voting Rights Act to say that you don't have to show that the legislature
Exactly.
in the state was doing this intentionally. That's because the Supreme Court tried to say you did have to show intent in a case called City of Mobile. All these cases coming out the South, not all of them. We'll talk about gerrymander in a moment if we have some time. But there's a three-part test called the Gingles factor that they established in 1986. And in the Alabama case that we just talked about, the black belt case there in Alabama, what they said was in 2024, last year, I'm sorry, 2023, the year before last, they said, yeah, y'all violated this Gingles test. The test is very simple, and I'll stop with that, and then we can talk about it. Number one, a minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact to comprise a majority of a district. Clearly, you passed that in Louisiana, you passed it in Mississippi, you passed it in Alabama, you passed it in Texas. Number two, The minority group must be politically cohesive. Now that gets a little bit tricky because we know all black people, all brown people, all white people don't vote alike. That's what Louisiana was trying to argue in some ways
Mhm.
before the Supreme Court. We know there in Texas where you are, the area Dallas Fort Worth, the area Harris County, Houston, in fact, all the major cities and counties
All
surrounding
the
them
major cities,
are
yes.
blue. So they're trying to break that up. And then the third of the test is that white voters vote sufficiently as a block, usually to defeat the minority group's preferred candidate. That's an easy thing to show.
That
You
is an
see,
easy thing because
so
the
anyway,
statistics show that you can be a white candidate running in an area where you have a plurality of black voters, and that white candidate can win. But the reverse is not true. We
that's right.
just do not have evidence that a black candidate can go into a predominantly white district and win. So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, sis, it was really painful to listen to the brilliant arguments of Janelle Nelson and the conversation between she and Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Ketanji Onyeka Brown Jackson. It was still painful because you have to acknowledge that even when members of the same political party vote, the black person who is running in the same political party gets fewer votes than the white people voting in the same political party, thereby showing that racial discrimination exists across the political spectrum. It was very painful to hear her make that
And you
point.
know
And
what? And to that point, I thought you were being very generous when earlier you said it's just a small percentage or a small group of hardcore white nationalists that are pushing this agenda, because I think it lets a lot of other people off the hook. You are literally voting these MAGA and these white nationalists. I do not call them conservatives because if we really go by the letter of the law, I would be considered a conservative if you look at my
yes,
values. And
most
they're
black
not
people would.
conservatives.
Yes,
Yeah, most black people I think would probably be
yes,
more conservative than the average white person. So they are white nationals. They're fascists. They're racist. I'm saying it's yes. And
yes.
so to the extent that the average white person is going along, they may not be directly funding these attacks, but they are supporting this whole tide, if you will, and promoting the individuals who are leading the charge. So I'm not letting any of them off the hook.
Well,
You are part of this problem. And so when you talk to me about patriotism, and I'm like, you are literally breaking your own country, but hey,
oh, they're breaking it.
all empires fall at some point. That's
That's exactly
don't
right.
come for me. That is a historical fact.
No, no, you know what? You're right. I was being generous, and you're absolutely right. Thank you for, as Joe Madison would say, putting it where it goes to get it and make it plain, as Malcolm X would say. The interesting thing is driven by fear.
Mhm.
Hatred is there as well, but that deep fear. It's very interesting, isn't it? People are terrified of uh, queer people. People are terrified of non-gender bathrooms, even though probably all of us grew up in households with those. People who
Yeah,
are
my
terrified
bathrooms are non-gendered in my house. I don't know
in
about
my
yours.
house too, right? You know what I'm saying? Since we only had one, I think it was not anyway. So yeah, I mean, people who are terrified of clowns, terrified of you name it, driven by this fear, but they haven't always uh, exercise that at the federal level. The Voting Rights Act, as we said, was signed into law in 1965. The first extension of the Voting Rights Act was 1970. Richard Nixon, overwhelming bipartisan support. 5 years later, Gerald Ford signed an extension of the Voting Rights Act. And in 1982, a 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act was signed by, forgive me for cussing, Ronald Reagan. 25-year extension of the why why not in 5 year increments? Because the attacks on the Voting Rights Act had already started. As I said, the first one in 1966. In 1982, that City of Mobile case, they were like, yeah, you got to show the Supreme Court's like, yeah, you got to show intent. So what did Congress do? They passed 1982 amendments that said you don't have to show intent, and Reagan signed it into law for 25
5
years.
years.
And as you mapped out brilliantly at the beginning of the conversation, all these black elected officials started coming into office. The first two from the South since Reconstruction, Andrew Young out of Atlanta, Georgia, and the great Barbara Jordan out of Texas. These are the
Great
first two
Barbara
black.
Jordan.
You know
Third
what I'm
ward.
saying? Yeah,
Yes.
come on now. You better shout out the third one, no question. And so, what do they see? This fear then drives them to continue to go to court, continue to go to court. But of all people, with bipartisan support, Ronald Reagan kicks the can down the road for 25 years in 1982. And in 2006, they extended for another 25 years. And lo and behold, who that was? Texas's own George W. Bush. 2006, they extended for another 25 years. So people listening might say, well, then what's the problem? The problem is they keep coming to court. And what happened was they didn't have the white nationalist majority yet that they have now. Now they've got a MAGA majority, the MAGA six, which includes, of course, the American Negro Clarence Thomas. They've got the Supreme Court. So every time Congress is passing these laws, in this case, extending the
Hold
Voting
up,
Rights
hold
Act,
up.
go
Let's
ahead.
put a
Yes.
pin right there. They've got the Supreme Court because, well, it's more
Yeah,
nuanced
yeah.
than
No.
that.
Break this
But
down. No,
let
please.
me say,
Yes.
there were many of us who could have voted to make some changes in Congress and in the Senate during the quote unquote Obama years. And I think we elected Obama and just kind of went back to chill out because he was going to do it all on his own. And the next thing you know, we don't have the votes that we should have, that we could have had. And people like Lindsey Graham were able to, let's not talk about who Obama tried to put him in on the Supreme Court, but he still would have been better than any of the people that have since been appointed. But that falls through. Lindsey Graham looks people in because we forget, looks in the camera, looking at the people and saying, and if it's a Republican president and it's in the final year of their presidency, we will not, right, allow a Supreme Court justice to be sat. And then Amy Coney Barrett was what, 8 days?
How about
What was
that?
that
Boom.
record?
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg
So
passed. That's right.
you can't believe anything these people say on any level, but carry on.
Nothing. No. That is a very important point for everyone listening. And please, probably people who listen to you understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But you have members of your family, you have people who have been washed with disinformation and the weaponized ignorance that now proliferates who don't. Have this conversation with them, y'all. Play this conversation because what we just heard Councilor Nelly do is walk us through exactly why voting matters. Those courts have been the way that these white nationalists have been able to hold on to their dying fever dream of a white republic. It isn't just the legislature, it isn't just the presidency, the governors, the state legislators, the local officials. And I was listening to something the other day which said that in the next few months there are going to be 50,000 elections in this country. We think about the presidency, we think about Congress, we think about the Senate, but no, the local elections, all those elections, we are still battling in the ballot with the ballot, but the courts are their line of last defense. And it took them that long to get close enough to pack the courts with enough of their ideological kin to be able to do this. And as you just explained to us, the critical moment was the election of 2016 when Donald Trump came into power the first time. And then again, the next critical election, the election of 2024. And it could very well be that they put the seal on any possibility of this country remaining in its current form. It won't mean that we won't survive. There's going to be a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot of suffering. But ultimately, this probably had to happen. And we can talk about that and how voting rights plays a role. I will mention just one other thing that since 2010, well, actually, not since 2010, the first half decade really of the 2010s, from 2010 to about 2015 or 16, the Department of Justice had 18 Section 5 objections to voting laws in Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Remember, Section 5 was what they were after. And so once they got the pre-clearance stuff kicked out by making sure there was no formula after they attacked Section 4, now they're going after Section 2 to wipe it clean. But the important thing is that after, right alongside Shelby County versus Holder, which is means let's draw these lines to neutralize political power. They were also working on other ways to neutralize political power. So, for example, since 2011, these strict voter ID requirements, cuts to early voting, to voter registration, all of that stuff, voter restrictions in places like Texas and in places like Wisconsin, very important to understand. Texas passed one of the most restrictive voter ID laws. Under the Voting Rights Act, the state was required to submit that law to the Justice Department. This is just before Shelby County versus Holder. This was 2011, and they passed this strict voter ID law, and the court at that time blocked the law, citing racial impact. That same year, South Carolina passed a voter ID law, and it got blocked by the Justice Department. But after Shelby County versus Holder, they come back. Let's get some of these strict voter ID laws. Indiana, Wisconsin. In other words,
29 states have passed restrictive voter ID laws. And that's just the passage of those laws. The other things that are happening, for instance, in the state of Texas, but in other places, the closure of places where you can get government IDs. So there are places in Texas where you have to drive over 200 miles to get to the building, the office, whatever, where you can get a voter ID, depending on what your resources are like. If you are an hourly employee, you don't have a vehicle, those kind of things. Of course, if you try to vote absentee ballots in Texas, the hoops you have to jump through, unbelievable. Because I have children outside who are now students outside of Texas who still try to vote, and it's absolutely ridiculous when we say we want, quote unquote, people to be engaged, but we put up every barrier possible.
that's exactly right. That's exactly, and we all know, of course, that they don't want people engaged. And as you said, people don't have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to travel maybe 20 miles, much less 200 miles. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We see it with your college age children. I see it every day at Howard. Howard, in many ways, is the world's historically black college here in the United States. Students come from all over the African world, and which of course means all over the United States as well. And many of those students, rather than, particularly if they're from the South, they don't even try to ask for the absentee ballot. They spend their own resources, their parents' resources, their family's resources, and book a flight or book a bus trip or train and go back home to vote because they don't trust.
Yep.
And in fact, in the most recent presidential election, I had a number of students from the South who complained uh, bitterly because they had sent for absentee ballots and their ballots arrived after the election. So, I mean, it was like, this is clear. These are clear violations. But the current Supreme Court, of course, would not have their back. One other thing, since January 2014, when a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a Voting Rights Amendment Act to repair the damage done the previous year by Shelby, there have been attempts to introduce legislation that would cure this problem. Again, here's a swing and a miss by some soft white nationalists in the Democratic Party. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act was introduced during the reckoning summer of 2020, of course, was when Congressman Lewis was still alive. And when the Democrats won the presidency, and for a brief moment had the votes perhaps to get a John Lewis Voting Rights Act through and a George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, they did. I won't say they dropped the ball because, shout out to Joe Manchin, Christian Sinema, and other soft white nationalists who were
Yep.
never for anybody but themselves. They blocked those votes and they blocked that legislation. So it couldn't make it to Joe Biden's desk. Now, that means that people say, well, I'm tired, I'm fatigued. Yeah, well, buck up. Because if Aya Aneli can find 50 hours in a 24-hour day, you can find enough time to make sure you check your voter registration, you get together so that in the next election cycle, you can do something about this. But I just mentioned one other thing. So we talked a little bit about the voter IDs, the strict voter IDs to try to neutralize votes. You pair that with kicking the teeth out of people by redistricting them and trying to neutralize their vote in their districts where they've been reassigned. Well, then you look several years ago, 2021, at the Brnovich case. This is Brnovich versus the
Yep.
Democratic National Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Section 2 gets kicked again because the court makes it more difficult to enforce Section 2 by making it difficult for individuals to bring these discrimination cases and voting lawsuits to court, and by then narrowing the type of entities that can represent individuals in court. They just keep chipping away at people's ability to exercise the protections of the Voting Rights Act, which means exercise the protections of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed when the smoke of the Civil War was still in the air. They are determined, as they have been every time people in this country have put their lives on the line to expand the franchise, to roll it back. And that Brenovich case is critical in that process.
Absolutely critical. And again, bringing it back to Texas, we actually did file a suit after we
Yes.
got racially gerrymandered. It's not just gerrymandering, it's racial gerrymandering. And they
Yes.
created this donut hole, and a number of us came together, and with the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and some other entities as well, we filed a suit. And we have one of the most, I think we have the most, I won't call it conservative, the most white nationalist appeals court in the country, and our Supreme Court here. And basically, the Fifth District, for those of you who are tracking, they just chipped away and chipped away. No, this plaintiff cannot be a part of this for this reason, and this plaintiff can't be a part of this. And there was just so much signaling that eventually we had a conversation for a number of weeks to decide, do we carry on and give them a chance to really pass a law that hurts us, or do we, step back for now? And we made the decision to step back. Well, as a group, I would have said fight, but you got to be strategic about these things. But it is happening on a number of different levels. So for those of you who think that local politics doesn't matter, you're not paying attention. In fact, in Harris County, where we had a record number of Black judges who were elected, they have all come under considerable attack. Considerable attack. We're actually going up for a fundraiser for one of the judges next week. So pay attention. And right now we are voting. So those of you listening, it's Monday, November 3rd. You know that election day is tomorrow if you didn't already early vote. And I know that the vast majority of you have not, because I've been checking in with election judges and the numbers are dismal. And what these people are trying to do, we have 17 constitutional amendments that they want to make, propositions that they want to make, amendments they want to make to the Constitution. And there's only one that I voted for. All the other 16 I voted against, because these are issues that should not be handled by the Constitution, because once they're in the Constitution, that's it. These are issues that should be handled in other spheres. So it's not that they're things that we can't discuss. Now, some of them, they were just solving problems that didn't even exist. But many of them have, all of them actually, except one, there's no reason it should be a constitutional amendment. But guess what? They have these constitutional amendments during these quote unquote off season, these off year elections, because only a handful of people go to vote. And I've been going to the different polling sites and I see who's coming to vote. And Black people, Hispanic people, you're not there. I spoke to one brother today who gets paid from taxpayer money. He works in the building where the where the polling station is. So he literally can just get out of his car and walk 2 feet. There were no lines whatsoever. I walked right in and voted, and I was the only one in there voting. And he said, he happens to be Hispanic, and he said, oh, I don't vote because I don't do politics, because no matter who you vote for, it doesn't matter. So I'm telling people, please go out and vote tomorrow. And if you have if you're concerned about, hey, I don't know what these propositions are about, on October 27th, our entire show went through each proposition step by step, and we talked about things that you should consider. We told you how we would vote, but we gave you the information for you to be able to make your own decision. So go to Rethinking Freedom. If you're listening on the radio, because I know many of you listen to us as you're going to work, Go to the YouTube channel Rethinking Freedom, October 27th, and you can listen to the whole breakdown of the propositions. And by the way, because I know that a lot of veterans listen and military folk listen to us on the radio, the two sisters who joined me on that episode are veterans as well, and
Yeah,
they're paying
could,
attention. They've got information for you. Please
could
go
I
ahead,
say,
Carr.
no, I just wanted to emphasize, I wanted to really thank you for two things. Number one, very specifically, and and you're absolutely right. Thank you for everyone listening now. They're here who is there in Texas. That conversation you had with Camille Francis Howard and Gwen Simmons
Yes.
is critical. So as people do this over and over again, whether it be judges, whether it be constitutional amendments, people go to the polls and basically stick their thumb in the air because they haven't studied any of it. Well, you solved for that in that hour. It was brilliant. It was precise and concise. It walked through all the constitutional amendment proposals. That's number one. Number two, anyone listening here who is not in Texas, or even if you are and want to share, it was a clinic on how to do that. So I hope other radio hosts, other podcasters, other television people will take this as a model for doing it in your state, in your city, in your how you walk through, because this is one of the biggest things that becomes an impediment, becomes a problem, even for people who are voting. They'll come in and say, well, I don't know who's on the school board, or what is this language? I don't even know. So what you did was do us a service, not only in Texas, not only right there, but also I think it's a model to be replicated everywhere else. So y'all go back, particularly pay attention to that session of Rethinking Freedom. I thought it was brilliant. So I just wanted to add that, as you said.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm learning from some really great people like the Jolly Dr. Carr. So
No. And what you also what you're doing here as well, you're bringing in people. See, this is the other thing that these people try to create is this sense, as we know. Of course, I'm stating the obvious. This sense of inevitability, like we're the majority, we're the silent majority. That's a lie. And week after week in Rethinking Freedom, you're not just sitting there by yourself, which you could easily do and walk through. You're inviting all kind of people in to have conversation. And what it shows us is this is we the people. If he was, who are we the people? We the people are in Rethinking Freedom every week. Listen to the people who are actually doing the living in this community. Because the other thing is, when you turn on all the lights, like roaches, these white nationalists scatter. They don't have any heart when we all show up. We're seeing that with the No Kings work. You've seen it. I watched you go out in the street many times. People find heart when they find the people who are also out there. And so that too is critical. So thank you for saying, yeah, you are absolutely learning from everybody because you bring everybody into the conversation and allow us to learn as well. So it's very important. Yeah, very important, very important. I do want to mention that another issue that we see, of course, is that the Supreme Court, and we know this, of course, the Supreme Court and the courts generally make up law by interpreting plain language, as we talked about it a minute ago, in ways that they prefer. We saw that in South Carolina. There was a case filed by the South Carolina NAACP. This case was decided in 2023. In that case, in South Carolina, they had done ridiculous racial gerrymanders and they had cracked and packed. In fact, and here I'm going to put a footnote in because this is to Black elected officials who seem to value their seat over anything else. In this case, it involved two people whose names we know. Nancy Mace, who has done some ridiculous stuff in the federal legislature out of South Carolina, and the district neighboring her district, which the Republicans of South Carolina tried to make more safe by moving some Black voters out of her district into this majority Black district and packing it further. Well, that district's represented by Jim Clyburn. Jim Clyburn, who was already going to be elected, but now they
yeah,
put a few more Black people in his district and take them from Nancy Mace's district to get a little bit more safety for her. And it's like, hey, man, you got to scream bloody murder at the top of the rooftops. You're going to be reelected. I'm
you're
saying
going to
all
be
that to,
reelected.
you
Yeah.
know, but I said that to say this. This was a case that came out of Wisconsin a few years before that. But in South Carolina, this is the most recent example. The Supreme Court, what do they say? They say, well, it wasn't a racial gerrymander. It was a political gerrymander. And political gerrymanders are non-justiciable. That's what racists, that's what white nationalists are arguing. Well, it's not Black versus white. It's Democrat versus Republican. And the political parties can do this as much as they want, and nobody can say anything. Of course, the argument on the other side is those political, as you said a minute ago, those political gerrymanders are proxies for racial gerrymander. However, The Supreme Court in the South Carolina case with the NAACP, South Carolina branch of the NAACP said, yeah, that is a political gerrymander. It's not justiciable. So they sent it back down to the district court because they said, well, those aren't racial gerrymanders. That's their other nasty trick in their nasty white nationalist toolbox to try to blunt, to practice their racism. They will simply say it's political, not racial. And that's, another hill that we're going to have to climb. Ultimately, I do think that these these judicial decisions can be reversed, but it's going to require different judges. And unfortunately, if they, anyway, go
It's gonna require different judges. And for those paying attention, I mean, if you look at the end of the first Reconstruction, how
ahead.
many years passed, how many decades before we started to really get traction again? I mean, we always did what we needed to do for our communities, and of course, at that point, we had to rely on each other. Right now, you have too many Black people who think they are exceptional Negroes. But it was almost 100 years before you get to the Voting Rights Act, right? And we
That's right.
know about Selma. Some of you can see the statue of Martin Luther King in the background. That was very intentional.
Yes.
And just the bloodshed that it took for us to even get these voting rights, the Voting Rights Act. And so for me, it just, quite frankly, I'm incensed when I hear particularly Black people think that they are being so smart when they talk about there's no reason for them to vote and their voting doesn't matter. And I know that we've had scholars. Some people would immediately pull on, W. Du Bois. Well, he said he wasn't going to vote either, and so on and so forth. But as we talk about what's happening with the Voting Rights Act, what message do you have for the people?
Well, I'll resist the urge to call those people, particularly the armchairs bourgeois academic radicals who live comfortably and float above issues, for example, like November the 1st SNAP benefits being taken or their health insurance premiums quadrupling or quintupling. I'll resist the urge to call them out for the cowards that they are. I guess I didn't resist the urge. You're cowards. Okay, let me just say that. You're cowards and you're too smart by half. In fact, I don't think you understand half the stuff you claim to have read, because if you did, you would know that you must step in the gap for the least of these. You're not going to suffer. But then again, maybe you will suffer now, particularly when your premiums go up. So that's enough I'll say about that. But what you just said is a beautiful place to land. It really is, sis, because um, we know that when we were drugging this criminal enterprise, we were drug into a criminal enterprise where less than 6% of the people in the criminal enterprise had the right to vote at its inception, at the inception of the United States. I'm not even counting you and me. I'm not counting the Africans or the indigenous. We weren't even factored in. I'm talking about the white people. It was only these rich white males. And then as they expanded the criminal enterprise and continued their settler colonialism, they let more and more white males in until eventually they had a majority of white males who were able to vote. But it took a civil war because they were fighting with each other for us to see a point of entry and an opening point to fight our way into the polity, not because we necessarily wanted that as our best choice. For generations, we wanted to go back to Africa. And then after that, we wanted to be left alone. We used the vote as a weapon to be left alone, to be able to live our lives and have some guaranteed protection so that we can do what we want to do. Anybody trying to live all up under y'all? No, we just want to be protected like everybody else. You shouldn't have come get us in the first place. And as you said, it took a century after those Reconstruction amendments, a century to claw our way back to enforce those amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, by way of a freedom movement called the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s. And immediately as that movement was beginning to reach some traction with the Voting Rights Act of 65, these white nationalists regrouped, backed by more and more big money people like Lewis Powell, who suggested there must be a think tank. That's where the Heritage Foundation come from. And they fought a 60-year war to reclaim it again. And here we are at the verge of another civil war. We could say it's a proxy war in the courts. It's a proxy war in the legislatures and in the ballot box, except that ICE is in the streets. There are many people listen to you on the weekly who are terrified, children scared to go to school, people scared to go to work. The state of Texas is a central battleground for that. And so here we are. If we lose this battle, then the next battle is not going to be in the ballot box because people ain't just going to sit down and die. And I don't care how many of y'all, you weak muscled little men with your handkerchiefs on your faces who think you can drop out the sky and put your hands on people. I don't know how long you think that's going to continue. If you take the ballot from people, if you take every other option for the people, then they're going to say, well, I guess I better sit down and die. No, they're going to see you somewhere else. And when they see you somewhere else, we're going to find out what kind of muscle you got. I do not want to see that happen. I know you don't. I know none of us do. But we know history teaches us that that's the next stage, because they don't have that kind of muscle. And that's what we face. If we don't handle this one way, it's going to be handled another way.
I hear you. So we've got about 5 minutes left. As you were just talking, I was thinking about a different community outside of the United States of America. And there was a time when some young men were basically just rampaging through the community and doing a lot of foul things. And their mothers, but people didn't know the identities of the men who were doing it. But their mothers told. Their mothers were like, no, you cannot do this. And all those young men were rounded up. So, ice with your handkerchiefs and so on and so forth. For those of you who think you can stay anonymous, eventually people are going to experience enough pain, and they are going to fight back in other ways. Not advocating for anything, but human beings are going to speak up. So we've got about 4 minutes left. Are there some marching orders that you have for our people? Like, one of the things that I would say is, do add the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to
Absolutely.
your budget. I don't care if it's $1.
Absolutely.
$1 a month, but millions of us doing it. They
Absolutely.
need resources to be able to fight back. It actually costs money to fight these battles. And the vote is one way to fight, but these courts battles, that's another tool as well. And we actually have to fight on all fronts. So that's one example. But what else would you say to people as to how they can fight back in this time? Or resist? How can we resist?
I think we have to educate ourselves and study, and I'll come back to that in a second, because you're doing that work in this radio and cyberspace classroom. I think we need to always check your voter registration. Always, I don't care. Well, I voted last year. Yeah, check it, because voter purging, we didn't talk about voter purges. They're trying to get their hands on the rolls now. The federal government trying to purge people from voting rolls. And to your point, LDF filed a lawsuit back in the spring to challenge Trump's unlawful executive order to require a passport or similar documentation of citizenship in order to register to vote. They're in court now on that. And in last April, the feds a federal court blocked the documentary proof of citizenship requirement. That's huge in places like Texas and all over the country. And then finally, I would say, you don't need another thing to do, but I think Texas, Alabama's huge, obviously, in this. North Carolina, we didn't talk about the whole Shaw versus Reno line, which kind of opens up this redistricting stuff.
So we're just going to have part two. So those of you on the radio, we're going to do a hard stop because we have an hour on the radio, and then you got to come over to the YouTube side at Rethinking Freedom to hear the rest of the conversation, because we have about a minute plus left here.
Okay. Well, then all I was going to say very quickly is, and you know this because you've studied it and you've been in some of these places, when you talk about Nixon versus Herndon and Smith versus Allwright and Terry versus Adams, these were Black people in Black places in Texas who fought during the deep days of Jim and Jane Crow, as you've talked about. So the last thing I would say we can do, study those cases, because we faced worse under worse circumstances, and those Black people came together out of Black communities. And you're teaching us that every week. And I was saying, maybe that's one to do a section on just the Texas voting rights cases and the people who fought those cases.
So are you saying you're going to come back to have
Yes, I'm going to come back and listen to you walk through Smith and walk through Brother Nixon.
No. Sir, you are the law professor.
No. You are the practicing lawyer, the freedom fighter lawyer. Thank you for the invitation, Ms. Eneli, and for all your work. And Rethinking Freedom is the bomb we need. Thank you for this classroom.
Okay, so for those of you who are over on the YouTube side, we're going to continue this conversation. Dr. Carr, what else would you like to share as we talk about, the first visit here, we talked about America on the precipice, and we went through, well, as much as we could in an hour. We went through Project 2025, which at that time, the felon in chief, the adjudicated rapist, said he didn't know anything about Project 2025. He hadn't heard of it, whatever, or maybe he'd heard of it, but he had nothing to do with it, and that was not anything he was going to be implementing. And what we've seen is they have actually surgically attempted to implement everything that they have there. And we're all catching hell in different ways. So today, as I thought about you coming back, I'm like, well, if we were on the precipice before we elected this bozo, this felon, I think we've fallen off the cliff. So we're in free fall right now. Hence the title of this episode. But what else would you like our guests, our listeners to know? How else would you like them to think about what we should be doing? Because what I'm also sensing is there's a lot of, I like the fact that you were sharing that we need to educate ourselves.
Yes.
Because I see a lot of hand wringing, a lot of, oh, what can we do? And it's like our ancestors faced way worse than this. So when we wear those t-shirts that say I'm my ancestors' wildest dream, I'm like, take that crap off. You know what we're talking about.
Take it off.
So for those again who what else should people be thinking about? And if you have any specific ideas, although each community has its own, peculiarities, what can we be doing as a community instead of just sitting back and hoping that things don't get worse?
I think pursuant to what you just said, studying, people say, well, okay, I understand that. We study, we know all that now. Let's act. My response is, no, you don't. You don't know. We don't know. We haven't studied, because if we studied and learned the lessons of the past, we would act differently. And I mentioned when we were on the radio side, those cases out of Texas. The first case that comes to mind is Nixon versus Herndon, which was 1927. It's interesting to see because there are lessons there. What lessons do we learn? For example, Lawrence Nixon. Lawrence Nixon was a Black physician. He sued for damages using the federal civil rights law during that period. There's no Voting Rights Act of 1965. There is a 15th Amendment. And they're saying that he said, I didn't get a ballot in the Democratic Party primary election because of my race. This is during the period when the Democratic Party in Texas and other places said Black people can't join our party, Black people can't vote, and whoever won the Democratic primary was going to win the general election because that's where people were registered. Well, Dr. Nixon said, hey man, y'all won't let me have a ballot. And so the court found in favor based on the 14th Amendment, not discussing the 15th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law. What's the lesson we learned there? A couple of lessons right there. Number one, if you're part of the Black middle class, your money is not going to save you. Your suburban house, your Jack and Jill, it's not going to save you. Be like Lawrence Nixon. Be like Dr. Nixon and say, I'm battling not just for me, but for all these people who don't have the money, who aren't able to do that. The other lesson is, if you're thinking about going to law school, I'm talking now to the middle school students, the elementary school students, the law school students who are in law school right now, the college students, understand that that degree isn't just for you to go out and make a whole bunch of money. Be like Ms. Eneli. I'm practicing law every day, and I'm also continue to do the social justice work because Dr. Nixon needed a lawyer. You got to understand that. So then Texas comes back after Dr. Nixon wins that Nixon versus Herndon and amends the statute in the state of Texas to authorize the political party's state executive committee to set voting qualifications. They try to hide it by saying, well, no, the Democratic Party of Texas decides that. It's not up to us. So what does he do? He goes back to court, Nixon versus Condon. And the court again found in his favor with the 14th Amendment. Very important to understand. But then you have Smith versus Allwright. Now, you've visited those places. What's the name of that? Is it the Gregory Library in Harris County, Texas, in Houston?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Gregory, where you learn the African American history. Well, it's very important because I think Dr. Smith was a dentist in Harris County, Texas. He sued. Smith versus Allwright is a huge case. In the Texas Democratic Party, the question was, does denying Blacks the right to vote in the primary election violate the Constitution? The court said yes. And I'm saying that I gave that example because you've got an example of solidly Black middle class, upper class folk who are fighting on behalf of and in solidarity with the poor, particularly the Black poor. And so the lessons we can learn in 2025 is You should use your whatever economic advantage you may have, but you got to pour that back in the community. And people say, well, what do we do? How do we? No, 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 no. There are important moments. This is that Sankofa moment we always talk about. Go to the past to see how people who were in your class position did this when the odds look completely hopeless. But
Completely hopeless.
for two reasons. One, because it was effective. Well, actually three. One, because it was effective then. Two, because the courts have changed between now and then, and you can learn lessons on what actually may survive constitutional muster and what may not, and what you should stop relying on. Because if they're willing to tear up their constitution, then you know you don't need to go the legal route all the time anymore. You can organize economic boycotts. That was very effective in Texas. We're not going to buy in these places. And then the third and final thing we can learn from all of this is that in this moment, as we see what they did, as we make the adjustments, we can also understand that when it looks hopeless, it's never hopeless. And we find we don't just draw lessons and tactics and strategies, we draw inspiration. Because that's when and during that period, the 20s and 30s, they openly lynching black people in the streets. And we may be returning to that. So people say, well, I've never seen this before. You clearly haven't looked at the 1920s and 30s in Texas. That's why I
Well,
don't listen to
in
commentators
Texas,
and say,
you don't have to go to the 1920s. I don't live too far from Waco, Jasper, Texas, where Brother Bird.
yeah, James Byrd. That's right.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
And that was not too long ago. That was in
That's
the
exactly
1990s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. You know, it's interesting listening to you and listening to your show and listening to your shows. One of the things that this space that you occupy now, a bridge, making the global local and kind of then reaching into memory, particularly pulling sisters from our memory to kind of make them live again and how we understand those. One of the things it does is give us a benchmark by which to compare public commentary. I've been very critical, of late. There's been this whole conversation about anti-intellectualism in Black communities. And I'm not going to name the names of any shows or any people, but I will say that the idea that we move to the lowest common denominator and we're in public conversation with people who have clearly not done their homework, who are very sincere, very well-meaning, but who then project this idea that somehow they are setting a standard when in fact they are the anti-standard setters. What you're doing, what we're having, this conversation we're having, and what you do week after week is remind
You mean
us
what you do week after week?
what we do and all we trying to cover all the bases and bring everybody in. Yes. And so what we are doing week after week is trying to model what a standard looks like so that we'll have something to compare it to. I mean, I think about the fact that there you are in Texas. And the things people say about Texas and the people in Texas clearly don't stack up to the people in Texas. If you were hopeless, you wouldn't be fighting like you fight. And so
No.
when I hear people say, well, yeah, we've been here, or they'll say this is more specifically, they'll say, oh, we've never faced anything like this. Okay, you shouldn't be allowed to hold yourself out as a representative of anything other than you need to study some more because we have faced this differently. This is why this conversation we're having is so important. Y'all stop saying, oh, we have no precedent for it. Yeah, there's an absolute precedent for it. So that's what I'm saying.
It's so funny you would say that, not funny, haha. But I was rereading Shirley Chisholm's book on Unbought and Unbossed, and she had a line in there. If you're speed reading, you might miss it. But she basically said, and this was 1972, I believe. No, it was 71, and she said they redrew the map so that they're redistricting again, and somehow her home is one block outside of the district she represented. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, what Al Green and Jasmine Crockett are dealing with, and so many others across the country, this ain't new. I mean, it's been the same tactics, and they go back and apparently study what they've done before to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and they fine tune it. But yes, we do not need to act surprised if we're paying attention. And
That's
talking
exactly
about
right.
what do people with money with means do, this Wednesday, which is last week we covered Mary Ellen Pleasant, And
Yes.
one of the things she did was sue the streetcar. We're going to talk. You have to go and watch the episode to get a fuller picture of what that woman was able to do with her resources. And some of it might surprise you. But there are definitely people who have shown us, regardless of what your economic status is, your level of education. Let's look at Fannie Lou Hamer, and there's so many others. There's a role for each of us to play in
Yes.
fighting for our freedom and fighting for our liberation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. This is look, I'm always excited to be in conversation with you. So, um, how are you finding um the response? It's very interesting because I know that, like, unlike a lot of folks, what we do on Sirius XM is subscription based, and and then in class is separate, and we keep that on YouTube. But what you do, it reminds me of what Tavis Smiley and them are doing out in the West Coast in LA when they simulcast or broadcast beyond, except what they do with the black owned radio station out there that Tavis Smiley owns in Los Angeles. You can go on YouTube and you can see the whole shows. His show, Dominique DePrima, Jesse Jackson Jr., so many others. I think Cornel West and Nina Turner have a show, but it it is the same as the show on the radio, except they also put it on YouTube. But you in that public broadcast, anyone with a radio can hear, and then they mount it, digitally as well. But then you go over in this space, and I imagine then that there are two overlapping but different groups. I heard you talking about, military folks who are going to work or people listening. So I assume you get feedback then locally, even as this goes out across the world. Is it a
Yes.
different?
Yeah. No, please go ahead.
No, I was asking, is it a different, like, I mean, I'm assuming you encounter folk who listen in the streets as you go about your daily work. Is that how?
Yes, that's exactly how it's worked. So on the YouTube side, it's mostly people who do not live in our
Yeah,
environments,
yeah.
who are tuning in, but a lot of the topics also pertain to wherever they may live as well. So particularly when we did the one on the proposed amendments, there were a lot of people commenting and saying, yeah, I wish someone would do this in my area to help break this down. Because it is a lot. I mean, we're all trying to live out here. Life is very busy. I have a little bit more time now because most of my children are no longer in the home. But if it was 5, 10 years ago when I was carting kids up and down from one activity to the other, I wouldn't be able to do this. And so there is a role for all of us to play to get information out. So certainly we have, I would say, a more national audience on the YouTube side, except for times when there's an overflow and I say, hey, if you want the rest of the story, come over to YouTube. And most of our local listeners listen on the two radio stations that it's broadcast on. So 98.5 and 104.7 FM
I
are the
see.
two radio stations. So yeah, that's how it's worked out.
I see.
And we'll stay on for as long as they let us on. And since you asked the question, I always have to give a shout out to Baba Tunde, who's an elder in our community, who
Yeah,
you
boom.
know had the vision and opened these doors, because this was nothing that I was thinking about at all. I do want to say, in terms of the Voting Rights Act, and just what do you think the end game is here, just for people who are still confused about what is going on? Because there's still the issue that people initially were paying attention, and then now we're not anymore, of women. And if you've changed your name, what kind of documentation you would need to provide to be able to register to vote and to be able to vote. And it would really drastically impact the number of women who can vote, because many of us, we get married and we add on a name, or we change our names, or things of that nature. What do you think the end game is with gutting or the attempt to gut the Voting Rights Act, with all of these voter suppression laws, all of these restricting, all the different ways that they are attacking people's ability to engage politically? What's the end game?
It's interesting you asked that. I think we would probably agree to the letter as to the end game. The two of us, we've seen it. Um, for people watching this, Ms. Anelli, to the point. on that married name when she was Aya Fubara before she was Aya Fubara Eneli. That's what we go all the way back to Columbus, Ohio, and we engaged in political struggle on a college campus with Africans to committed to improving our nation. And there's a side that says we're human beings and we should live our lives with dignity, be able to maximize our human potential. And I think that's probably most people. It may even be everybody deep down. But then there are pockets of people who, for whatever reasons, accidents of birth, maybe it's even their genetic makeup for some of them, quite frankly, but who knows? But we certainly know socialization, I think, is probably the primary factor, if not the only factor, are driven to believe that they can't do that without hurting other people. Maybe they've been hurt themselves. They find some satisfaction or some protection or some way to evade the pain. They think deaden the pain by harming other people. And I think those basic forces we see in world history. We've both traveled. Uh, last August we were part of the team that helped people take a journey to Egypt. Not our first time. And we see the pharaonic structure there. People like Aikwe Arma are very critical of that process. Why do you have to have a society where you got pharaohs and priests and rulers telling people what to do or working on behalf of people? Maybe it's inevitable, maybe it's not. Week after week, as I said, you explore contemporary African politics, and you see nonagenarians like Paul Biya in Cameroon trying to hold on to power. If he,
You
if,
see, you see, you see, you see Cameroon is on fire.
it's on fire because people tired of that shit. And so, so when you talk about the end game, for some people, the end game is just power. The end game, for what driven by insecurity, fear, hatred, whatever. And I think that we see that. You come from a region of in the Bada Benin and Bada Afra where you see that on a daily basis in places like Nigeria, but then you've also explored the history where you see people, you see systems that try to contain that human impulse, and some systems work better than others. And I think we will both agree that many of the systems that are non-Western work much better, whether they be African, whether it be Asian, whether it be indigenous. But it doesn't eliminate those impulses, but it does try to manage them in a way to diminish them. But the Western structures feed those impulses. They
Yeah,
feed empire. They feed settler colonialism in a way. There were conflicts. Askia Muhammad had a standing army. You look at Songhai, you look at Ghana and Mali, you see conflicts. But what you don't see is these huge armies just standing in the barracks, because if they had had armies, we wouldn't be having this conversation in English, because we would have killed the Portuguese and the
that's
Dutch and
right.
all them if we had treated them. But we didn't think about it that way. And, as our teacher, John Henry Clark, would say, one of our problems is we just generous. We let people, strangers come in. Well, people say, well, what are you talking about? How does that relate to what we're talking about right now? When you look at a religious nationalist like Russell Vogt, and you took the painstaking time to read the entire Project 2025 and then talk about it in platforms.
Unfortunately,
No, I mean, no, and people thinking, oh, yeah, yeah. And of course, it took someone like Taraji P. Henson, shout out to Taraji P. Henson, and
yeah.
a casual
Shout out.
mention, on the BET Awards, a casual mention to get people, instead of people thinking, well, I need to read this, I need to know about this, they used it as a password to say, let me go out and vote. And then too many people didn't, and we're here. But I'm raising it because, as we know, Project 2025 isn't a policy document for or by policy wonks. It is a policy document by policy wonks that is out to enact an agenda that has nothing to do with policy or economics. These are religious zealots. They are religious extremists. They are to Christianity what you might say Al Qaeda is to Islam. They are not Christians. Russell Vogt is a religious zealot. He's a religious bigot. He's a religious zealot. Kevin Roberts out of Texas is a religious zealot, a religious bigot. They want a white nationalist Christian theocracy. And anyone who argues with them, they see as an enemy of civilization. This is Christopher Rufo talking about critical race theory. This is Charlie Kirk talking about whatever he was talking about at any given moment. And if anybody says anything against them, they then try
And
to,
for us, this is Greg Abbott, and
oh,
locally, it
no,
would be those of you who still call Brad Buckley your childhood friend. You went to school with him. His wife taught your kids all of that. The man is your open enemy. I'm just saying. But
yeah,
carry
no
on.
question. No, no, no. I'm glad you said that. It's that damn what's the attorney general's name in Texas? He's a
Oh, Ken
nasty piece of work.
Paxton,
Ken Paxton, and most
whose own wife is like, I can't deal with you anymore.
No question. And and people will say, well, this is slander. No, no, because these are the people that are most likely, I'm talking about these religious zealots, the ones who are talking about Christianity and women don't need to work and all this and they hate non-white people, and they've demonstrated it in their rhetoric. These are the people who you often see exposed in news reports for having their secret porno thing, and then the whole affairs and all. Yeah, so the hypocrisy is consistent with their attitude. So I think that is the end game for them, is to create a theocracy. This is what Margaret
Mhm.
Atwood was writing about in her series of novels that got serialized on television as The Handmaid's Tale.
The
They want
hand.
a theocracy.
Yes.
They want a theocracy. And then there's another element, though, and that element converges with this element because they can exploit it just as surely as poor whites began to gravitate toward the Knights of the White Camellia or the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. Some of these people ain't got a pot to piss in. But rich white people who knew they had to break up that potential class coalition between blacks and whites catered to their emergent racism and said, no, you need to come with us, even though these white people are laughing at them. Well, do you see that today? I'm sure you saw this week the news break out of New York. All these billionaires who
Yes.
are funding this Fix the City entity that
Yeah.
is going against Mamdani,
Danny.
Zoran Mamdani. The number one donor so far, at least if you Fortune magazine posted a list of these donors opposing Mamdani, the number one donor to the tune of $8.3 million. His net worth is $110 billion. That would be Michael Bloomberg. So in other words, then Joseph Geba gives $3 million. The Lauder family, I want all you Negroes who use that perfume, the Lauder family, $2.6 million. Why Bill Ackman, this nasty piece of work, almost $2 million, a million 7.5 so far to fix the city, this shadowy entity trying to oppose Mamdani. He's the one who went after Claudia Gay at Harvard. He's a nasty piece of work. Was sitting on the board of the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School. Why in your miserable life would you want to stop other human beings from living their full potential? You're a miserable human being, all of y'all. And you happen to have all this money, so you're part of the coalition. They're the ones funding these clowns. They're the ones who funded clearly these 3 or 4 people in Louisiana that mounted the Louisiana case, the Calais case to the Supreme
Yes.
Court.
I
So,
said, yeah.
so their end objective is to crack us dry and suck the moral of humanity so they can get one more yacht, one more vacation home, one more shadowy plane trip with their mistress somewhere beyond the reach of their family. This. So there are different objectives, but all of them share this in common. Finally,
Mhm.
they're just small-minded human beings who would rather have other people suffer than them face the fact that they got some real personal work to do. I think they don't really have an objective beyond that. And we know how those objectives end up. So as you said a minute ago, empires fall. Empires fall, and they're headed for fall. Ask Nero how that worked. Ask Caesar how that worked. Ask Caligula how all that worked. Y'all keep on doing it, and you will fall. The people will make it happen.
All right. So, final question, because I'm so grateful for your time.
No, I'm grateful.
How do you think this? How do you think the Supreme Court is going to rule on this issue? What are you hearing? I don't know if you want to share anything from what's our dear sisters, Justice Ketanji Brown has said, or
Ah,
she was she was ready, but then of course you listen to the commentary from Kavanaugh. There's got to be a time limit and all of that, and I'm thinking, wait a second. So let's say someone has hypertension. Let me just use that as an example because so many people can relate to that. You are using, whether it's herbal remedies or you're taking pharmaceuticals, but it's under control, and then you say, well, it seems like it's okay now, so we're just going to stop using the remedies. We're going to stop doing what was keeping it under control. What do you expect is going to happen? But so when you say there should be, when Kavanaugh is arguing there should be a time limit, and yet it is so clear that racism is alive and well and thriving in the US of A. How do you think this case is going to end up?
I would ask you the same question. I'll go first. No, I go first because you asked me first, but I want to hear what you had to say too, as well. I think we all do. I don't know. if I had to bet today, I would say they're going to obviously erode Section 2. The only question is how far. Kavanaugh, who's deeply unremarkable as a thinker, a pedestrian human being in terms of his at least demonstrated thought process. Kavanaugh pulled out of his hind parts a, a suggestion that echoed in some way Senator O'Connor with affirmative action with her
With
25
affirmative
years.
action. Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I don't know that he channeled her. It was even less it was more ham-fisted than her number. He didn't propose a number, but he gave a great example of judge-made law. That's nowhere in the statute. That's nowhere in the legislative history. It's certainly not in the legislative history. And Ketanji Brown Jackson does this time and time again, particularly when it comes to the 14th Amendment. She goes to the legislative record and she exposes the deep I won't call them hypocrites because there are other religious zealots on the Supreme Court. Samuel Alito is probably the nastiest piece of work on the Supreme Court in this regard, a religious zealot. They don't care about legislative records. They don't care about history. What they care about is white supremacy. And so when you hear Sam Alito in oral arguments and you read his opinions, when he's referring to a nasty invented narrative thread of American history that looks at the Indians as savages and looks at Sam Alito is a nasty piece of work, and Brett Kavanaugh is not as nasty as Sam Alito because quite frankly he's not as smart as Sam Alito. He's just a dumb affirmative action beneficiary. I say that because the only
Tell
type
us,
of affirmative
tell us,
action.
tell us how you really feel.
No. I mean, and I'm saying that because, and I'm not saying that based on some type of personal invective. I don't know Brett Kavanaugh. I'll probably never know him. He might be a nice guy to have a beer with, or certainly likes beer. But as a thinker, as someone, and when you just read his opinions and you listen to the oral arguments, what you're seeing is an unremarkable mind at work. And the only way somebody like that gets advanced to the highest echelons of a society is that society has been rigged and weaponized to advance people like that.
Yeah,
So when people talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, affirmative action, the only kind of DEI, the only kind of affirmative action in a white nationalist polity is whiteness. That white
yeah.
man is where he is because he is a white man. Because if Aya Aneli got up and made those arguments, you'd never got advanced to the Supreme Court. Wait a minute, they'd be
And,
like,
and,
wait a
and,
minute, did she
and the
just make up
FBI
something?
and the FBI would definitely have investigated me as opposed to what they did, where they were like,
Exactly.
okay, yeah, we're gonna have an investigation, and then nothing happened.
That's
Yes.
exactly right.
Yeah.
If you had pulled your private parts out of the party, then you would never have been out. And clearly, they made sure, shout out to Lindsey Graham, whatever else he's hiding, he certainly was able to hide Brett Kavanaugh's nastiness. But I'm saying all that to say that I think they will probably erode it. If they go so far as to follow Kavanaugh, they are going to do us a favor, I think, in the long term. You may be around to see it. I probably won't. Certainly your children will be around to see it. But Kavanaugh will add his name along with most of the people on this MAGA sick.
So you're thinking 6-3 to erode it?
Yeah, yeah, because Roberts can't stop him. And if you look at what Kavanaugh did in the Alabama case, in the Milligan case, he concurred, which, in other words, so he knew he couldn't win the day that day, but he begins to slip in some of the language that we may now see return in
Mm-hmm.
this majority opinion. And I think Roberts might go. He may concur in part, dissent in part, because John Roberts uh, he's going to go down next to Roger Taney. He's going to go down next to some of the white nationalists in Plessy versus
And those who
Ferguson.
don't know who Roger Taney is, go look up some of
Oh,
those older cases. You'll figure it out.
exactly. And this court is going to go down, I think, next to them. Clarence Thomas won't care because he'll be dead. And then, he'll have to work that out on the other side with all of us. But history will record Clarence Thomas as one of the most indefensible race traders of the period. Even though I think I agree with Corey Robin in his book, the on Clarence Thomas, that Clarence Thomas might think he's some form of black nationalist at different moments because he thinks he's doing black people a favor by saying we don't need no favors, just get the Second Amendment, put all the prisoners in jail. It's really a warped perspective, but I kind of agree in some ways with Corey Robin on that.
Nobody is asking for any favors.
No, at all.
Yeah.
No, but I do think that they probably will narrow Section 2. If they try to completely get rid of it, I think it could trigger the type of response that none of them are prepared for. But anyway, what do you think? What do you think they're going to do?
I don't know if this is more of a hope, a wish, as opposed to what I'm really seeing and what I think they'll do in that sense. I think that from some of the decisions that came down in their last session, that Roberts may be thinking that he has gone a little too far
I agree with that.
and trying to figure out how to pull things back. I think that if they are worth any salt, the Supreme Court justices, that they and if they're paying attention to what Trump is doing, that they have realized that they really have unleashed a beast. I mean, they have taken off most of the guardrails for this man when they said, hey, you can take out your political opponents, and because you did it as, under your presidential power, you can't be held responsible, which, by the way, leaves them very vulnerable as well. The only way to curb his power right now is to shift what Congress and the Senate, and where he just doesn't have, that pen and can just pass whatever he wants to, or it's going to be the military that intervenes. So we could be heading to, we've been fighting the Civil War. The Civil War never ended, but we're definitely in the throes of it in terms of the words and the actions that are taking place, even though they're not, we're not out on a battlefield with guns and weapons and drones and the rest of it. And so I'm wondering if there are not two more people with enough common sense, and I'm looking at Roberts and maybe Amy Coney Barrett, who say, we might want to pull back just a little bit if they have any love for their country.
That's a great observation.
So we shall see.
Yeah,
But
I agree with that. I agree with that. That's interesting. That is the X factor, isn't it? That was the X factor behind Brown. They worried about the United States reputation in the Cold War. You're right. That might be the X factor, the country. That's
because
interesting.
Trump is completely unhinged right now. I don't care if you're
Yeah.
RTI, whatever you want to call yourself. He is not that he feels like he's God. He can do anything, and we've got a little slim chance right here to reel things back in a little bit. And if they decide to further narrow this, gut this, the Voting Rights Act altogether, we look back at seminal moments that sparked movements, and this will be one more thing that added to the explosion that will occur at some point. Yeah. So we'll see.
That's excellent. Well, thank you. I know we done a whole nother show on the YouTube side.
Yes, we have. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for the way you model for us how to be out here in the world and how to think through things. And thank you for taking time out to join us on Rethinking Freedom.
Thank you. It's a mutual appreciation society. Thank you for all of that, which is the same with you. I appreciate you.
All right. Well, and for all our listeners, hey, leave a comment. You guys know how the algorithms work, and tell Dr. Carr how much you appreciate him being on Rethinking Freedom, so he'll take our call next time. Thank you all.
Like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to the channel. Come on, y'all. Drive that algorithm. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.